Are you lost, sweetie? The three nurses in teal scrubs didn't even try to lower their voices as the young black woman with a backpack walked by. Their laughter echoed in the bright hospital hallway. They had no idea she was the youngest chief of surgery in the hospital's history, in a country where only 2% of American doctors are black women. Her name is Dr. Alana Vance. At 32, her appointment wasn't just a personal triumph, but a rare crack in a system where men hold 86% of surgical leadership roles. This is what happens when ingrained bias meets institutional power. And in that frozen moment of laughter, one question hung in the sterile air. Who, in this hospital's rigid hierarchy, was truly out of place? The Midtown General Hospital, where Alana Vance now walked the halls, was a fortress of tradition, a place where the hierarchy was as visible as the color-coded scrubs. In this world, the surgeons, overwhelmingly male and white, occupied the top-floor corner offices with views of the city. The nurses, over 90% women, ran the floors below, and for decades those lines rarely blurred. Alana's path here was itself a statistical anomaly. She was a product of a pipeline that consistently leaks talent. While over 60% of black nursing professionals report facing racism at work, the climb for a black woman in surgery is even steeper, a gauntlet of implicit bias and credential questioning that starts on day one of medical school. She'd been asked if she was the social worker, the nutritionist, the patient transporter, everything but the doctor holding the scalpel. Each time, she'd learned to armor herself in a quiet, unshakable competence. Her appointment as chief of surgery was not a gracious gift. It was a desperate, calculated move by a hospital board feeling the heat. A malpractice lawsuit rooted in diagnostic bias had just been settled for millions. A damning internal review had found that patient outcomes varied significantly by the race of the attending physician. The board needed a symbol of change, and Alana's flawless record, top of her class at Johns Hopkins, a groundbreaking fellowship in minimally invasive cardiac procedures, made her the perfect, if inconvenient, candidate. The three nurses at the station that morning were embedded in the old ecosystem. There was Carol, the redhead with 23 years on the cardiothoracic floor, who'd seen surgical chiefs come and go, all of them men she could describe as Dr. What's-His-Name. Next to her, Jennifer, the blonde in her 30s, was deep in the gossip network that pulsed through the hospital's supply closets and break rooms. And the youngest, Mia the brunette, was still learning the unspoken rules of who deserved respect and who could be safely ignored. Their laughter at the lost woman with the backpack wasn't born of pure malice. It was a reflex of a system that categorizes by uniform and age and skin tone. A system where, studies show, healthcare providers often operate on automatic, unintentional bias. To them, a young black woman in civilian clothes carrying a backpack could only be a new nursing assistant, a patient's relative, or a student. The possibility that she was the person who would now sign off on their overtime, evaluate their unit's performance, and hold the final say in the operating room was a cognitive door that didn't even exist in their mental floorplan. Alana had anticipated this moment. She'd been briefed by the retiring chief, a man who warned her with a paternal sigh that the culture here is set in its ways. She knew the board's support was paper-thin, contingent on her smoothing over controversies, not creating them. The plan was a soft launch, a quiet first day, meetings with department heads, a gradual introduction. But as the nurses' laughter wrapped around her, that plan evaporated. The weight of every mistaken identity, every condescending "sweetie" from a colleague, pressed down on her in that fluorescent-lit hallway. She didn't break stride. She adjusted the strap of her leather backpack, the same one that had carried her textbooks through a decade of training, and walked past them without a glance, toward the administrative wing. The laughter died, not from recognition, but from the subtle shift in her posture. This wasn't the hesitant shuffle of someone looking for directions. It was the purposeful gait of someone who owned the space she walked through. The hospital director, Robert Alden, was waiting outside the surgical boardroom. A man in his 60s who measured success in budget lines and public relations. He saw Alana as both a solution and a potential problem. "Ready for the lion's den?" he asked, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Inside the room, the faces of the senior surgical staff, all men, turned toward the door. Their expressions ranged from curious to openly skeptical. But the real first test wasn't in that boardroom. It was happening 30 yards away at the nurse's station. Jennifer, scrolling on her phone, nudged Carol. "Who was that anyway?" "New admin hire," Carol, filing a chart, shrugged. "Maybe from the insurance company. They're always poking around." It was Mia who first noticed the email blast that hit every hospital inbox at exactly 9 a.m. sent from the office of the director. The subject line: "Announcing our new chief of surgery." She opened it, her eyes scanning the formal announcement, the list of accolades, the official welcome. And then she saw the photo. A professional headshot of a woman with medium brown skin, her hair in neat twists, a slight, confident smile on her face. The woman they had just laughed at in the hallway. The blood drained from Mia's face. She slowly turned her monitor toward Carol and Jennifer. For a long moment, there was only the hum of the computers and the distant beep of a monitor. The trio's earlier confidence shattered, replaced by a cold, dawning horror. They had publicly mocked their new boss within her first 60 seconds in the building. This wasn't just a social faux pas. In the rigid world of hospital politics, it was a career-limiting move. Jennifer's mind raced to the new overtime approval forms that required the chief's signature. Carol thought of the disciplinary note in her file from last year that was up for review. They weren't afraid of Alana Vance, the person. They were afraid of Alana Vance, the institution. The power she now wielded was absolute within their professional lives, and they had handed her a reason on a silver platter to use it. Meanwhile, in the boardroom, Alana was navigating a different kind of ice. The introductions were polite, stiff. The questions were technical, probing, designed to test her mettle. She answered each one with precision, her voice calm. But her mind kept drifting back to the hallway, to the sound of that laughter. It was a data point, a live demonstration of the very problem she was hired to fix. The question was no longer just about her survival. It was about method. Would she play the game, assimilate, and gently chide the nurses in private? Or would she use that moment as a catalyst, a public example to break a century-old culture? The senior vascular surgeon, Dr. Philip Creston, leaned back in his leather chair. "Your credentials are impressive, Dr. Vance, but Midtown General is a unique beast. Our nurses are the backbone of this hospital. Some of them have been here longer than you've been alive. That relationship, it requires a certain delicate touch." His message was clear: don't rock the boat. Don't upset the established order where surgeons commanded and nurses obeyed and everyone knew their place. Alana met his gaze. She knew the statistics he didn't quote, that a hostile work environment contributes to nurse burnout and medical errors, that diverse surgical teams produce better patient outcomes. Her legitimacy wasn't the issue. The legitimacy of the old system was. She ended the meeting with a promise to do rounds on all major units the following week. As she left the boardroom, her path would take her right back past the same nurses' station. The stage was set for a second act. This time they would be watching her, waiting for a cue. Would she stop and address them? Would she ignore them completely? Every option was a message. The three nurses had hastily straightened their station, their eyes fixed on computer screens with a frantic intensity. The charge nurse, having heard the news, was glaring at them from across the hall. Alana approached. The air grew taut. She could feel the panic radiating from them. This was her first real decision as chief, a decision that would send a ripple through the hospital's gossip mill before lunchtime. She slowed her steps right in front of their station. The silence was absolute. Alana didn't look at the nurses. Her eyes scanned the patient board behind them, a grid of names and room numbers and care protocols. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear, professional, and carried no trace of the earlier insult. "The post-op vitals for bed 412 are 2 hours overdue. Please ensure they're updated before shift change." It was a masterstroke. By ignoring the personal slight and focusing on a concrete lapse in protocol, she did three things at once. She asserted her authority as chief, she demonstrated that she was already auditing their work, and she denied them the drama of an apology scene. The power dynamic was reset, not with a shout but with a quiet, undeniable command. She continued down the hall, leaving a silence more profound than any reprimand. In that silence, the three nurses fractured. Carol, the veteran, felt a surge of hot shame that quickly curdled into resentment. Being corrected on a documentation error by a newcomer half her age in front of everyone was a blow to her professional identity. Jennifer, the gossip, was already calculating the damage control. She pulled out her phone not to work, but to text her network, spinning the narrative toward a power-tripping new boss before the other version could take root. But it was Mia, the youngest, who experienced a genuine stomach-churning shift. The look on Dr. Vance's face hadn't been anger. It had been disappointment, the weary look of someone who expected better. For Mia, who'd entered nursing with ideals of care and compassion, the realization that she'd been a participant in a casual act of cruelty was a shock to her self-image. She mumbled, "I'm going to check those vitals," and hurried away, her face burning. The story, as stories do in a hospital, mutated as it spread. By lunch in the cafeteria, there were two competing versions. The nurses' lounge version painted Alana as an arrogant academic, out of touch with the realities of the floor, making a petty power play on her first day. The admin version, whispered between younger residents and diversity committee members, celebrated her cool handling of a blatant microaggression. The hospital was choosing sides, and the fault line ran directly through Alana Vance's office. She spent her afternoon buried not in surgical schedules, but in personnel files and climate survey data. The numbers told a stark story. Employee satisfaction scores in nursing had plummeted over the past 5 years. Turnover among nurses of color was 30% higher than the national average. Grievances filed for hostile work environment had been consistently dismissed or settled with quiet confidentiality agreements. The lawsuit that brought her here was just the tip of an iceberg. Her intercom buzzed. It was Robert Alden, the director. "Alana, a word in my office, please." His tone was neutral, which she'd already learned was a bad sign. He was at his desk, not with a smile, but with an open folder. "I'm hearing some noise from the surgical floor about a somewhat tense interaction this morning." Alana remained standing. An interaction where 3 nursing staff openly laughed at and questioned the presence of the new chief of surgery. Yes, I'd describe that as tense. Alden held up a placating hand. "I'm not disputing what happened. Carol Jenkins has been here for 23 years. She's an institution. Her sister is on the city's health oversight board. My point is, the cultural shift we need requires diplomacy. Perhaps a private meeting, a clearing of the air." Alana understood the subtext. He was asking her to absorb the insult, to smooth it over, to maintain the peace with the old guard. This was the trap. To become the symbol of change without actually changing anything. To be chief in title but not in authority. She'd seen the research. When women, especially women of color, advocate for themselves, they are disproportionately labeled as aggressive or difficult. "I'll handle the staff, Robert," she said, her voice even. "My concern is the pattern the data reveals. A pattern that affects staff retention and, as our lawsuit proved, patient care. Diplomacy won't fix a broken system." She left before he could reply, the line in the sand now visible between them. Her next move was deliberate. She scheduled not a private chat, but a mandatory all-hands meeting for the entire surgical nursing staff the next morning. The announcement, sent via official memo, caused a minor earthquake. Mandatory meetings were for flu shots and HR compliance videos, not for conversations about behavior. The following morning, the large conference room was packed. A sea of teal scrubs, arms crossed, faces set in various stages of skepticism and anxiety. Carol, Jennifer, and Mia sat together, a united front of nervous defiance. Alana walked to the front without notes. She clicked a remote and a single slide appeared on the screen. It was not a photo from the hallway. It was a graph. This, Alana began, her voice amplified but calm, is our 5-year trend for medication administration errors on the surgical floor, the orange line. She pointed to a line that crept upward. And this, she clicked, a new bar chart appeared, is staff turnover by quarter. They move in near-perfect sync. She let that sink in. The room was utterly silent. You are the experts in this room. You know that errors increase when staff are overworked, undersupported, or operating in a climate of fear or disrespect. This isn't about blame. It's about cause and effect. She was speaking their language, the language of patient safety, of practical outcomes. She was framing the culture not as a touchy-feely HR issue, but as a critical clinical risk factor. My role as your chief is to remove the systemic barriers that create these trends. That starts with clear standards of professional conduct for everyone, from the interns to the senior surgeons to this office. She looked directly at Carol's section of the room. What happened yesterday in the hallway was a failure of those standards. It was a distraction, and in this hospital, distractions can cost lives. She had them. By focusing on the mission, patient care, she had bypassed their defenses. Jennifer's gossip network seemed trivial. Carol's years of service didn't immunize her from being part of a problem. Mia felt a glimmer of hope that things could actually be different. But then Alana delivered the pivot. Therefore, effective immediately, I am reinstating the Morbidity and Mortality Conference for nursing-led incidents, and I am creating a parallel, anonymous reporting system for interpersonal conduct that affects team performance. Every report will be reviewed. Every trend will be acted upon. The room erupted in a low murmur. The M&M conference was a surgical tradition, a brutal, transparent dissection of what went wrong in a case. Applying it to nursing was unprecedented. It meant accountability in a bright, uncomfortable light. The anonymous reporting system was a direct threat to the old, whisper network way of handling problems. As the staff filed out, buzzing with shock, Robert Alden was waiting outside the door, his face pale. "You instituted a peer review protocol without board approval," he hissed, pulling her aside. "It's within my purview as chief to establish clinical quality procedures," Alana replied. "The data justifies it. The lawsuit demands it." "The board," Alden said, his voice low and tense, "is receiving calls from donors, from Carol Jenkins's sister on the oversight committee. They're saying you're creating a witch hunt, that you're destabilizing the staff we can't afford to lose." The institutional pressure was now formal and financial. Her bold move to fix the culture was being recast as a liability. Back on the floor, the reaction was fracturing. A group of older nurses led by Carol clustered in a supply room, voices heated. "She's trying to scare us into submission," Carol spat. "M&M for nurses. She'll hang every mistake over our heads." But elsewhere, a younger black nurse named Simone approached Mia. "Finally," she said quietly, "someone who sees it." The war was no longer cold. Alana had fired the first major salvo for systemic change, but the counterattack was mobilizing, and it had connections far beyond the hospital walls. That evening, as Alana worked late in her new office, an email arrived. It was from the board chairman, marked urgent, pre-meeting brief. The subject: Review of Surgical Department Leadership Initiatives. Attached was a draft agenda for a special board meeting in 48 hours. The first item: discussion concerning disruptive leadership styles and operational risk. They weren't just pushing back. They were preparing to push her asterisk out. Her authority, her reforms, her entire tenure was now on the table, and she had one weekend to build a defense against the most powerful people in the hospital. But Alana didn't open the personnel files or draft a pleading speech. She opened a different folder on her desktop, labeled Project Nightingale. Inside were not complaints but solutions: restructuring plans, mentorship programs, partnership proposals with nursing schools. She had known the backlash would come, and she had prepared for it. She picked up her phone and made a call. "Simone, it's Dr. Vance. You said you wanted to talk about the mentorship idea. Can you come to my office tomorrow and bring anyone else who's interested? She was not going to fight the board with the board's rules. She was going to build a new power base from the ground up, starting with the very staff she was supposed to be alienating. The clock was ticking, and the battle for the soul of Midtown General had just shifted from the hallway to the boardroom. The meeting in Alana's office the next morning wasn't with senior surgeons or board members. It was with Simone, Mia, and 4 other nurses from different floors who had quietly responded to her call. They sat, some nervous, some defiant, in a semicircle. Alana began not with a pep talk, but with a question. What is the one thing, if changed, would make you want to stay at this hospital for 10 more years? The floodgates opened. They spoke of being ignored in patient care meetings, of having life-saving observations dismissed by senior residents until a male nurse repeated them, of the crushing workload that came from high turnover. Simone spoke bluntly about the coded language, communication issues. Not a team player. That showed up in the performance reviews of nurses of color who advocated for their patients. Mia confessed her shame from the hallway, and her fear that speaking up now would brand her a traitor to her unit. Alana listened, taking notes. This was the qualitative data behind the dismal graphs. Project Nightingale wasn't a theoretical plan. It was being drafted in real time from their testimony. She proposed a pilot program, a structured mentorship pipeline pairing senior nurses with new hires, with protected time and tangible career advancement credits. A council of staff nurses, elected by their peers, would have a direct channel to her office and a vote on new workflow policies. It was a radical redistribution of institutional voice. But as this new alliance was forming, the old guard was executing its own plan. Robert Alden, under pressure from the board chairman, authorized a climate assessment. The firm hired was not an impartial HR consultancy, but a well-known legal group specializing in management-side labor relations. Their method was simple: one-on-one interviews in closed rooms, with promises of confidentiality that felt more like traps. Carol Jenkins was one of the first interviewed. She spoke passionately about declining morale, about a new administration that valued data over experience, about feeling targeted for a simple misunderstanding. She did not mention her laughter in the hallway. The interviewer took meticulous notes. Jennifer, ever the networker, used her interviews to plant seeds. She spoke of whispers about Dr. Vance's true agenda, hinting that the new reporting system was a tool to purge veteran staff and replace them with less expensive new graduates. She framed resistance as a defense of the hospital's family. The legal team's report began to take shape, its conclusions preordained by the questions asked. The "wait, it gets worse" moment hit Alana from an unexpected angle. Late that night, she received a panicked call from a friend at the state medical board. "Alana, I just saw a filing. An anonymous complaint has been lodged against you. It cites creating a hostile work environment and questionable clinical judgment stemming from divisive leadership." The complaint was thin, but it was official. It triggered a mandatory preliminary review. Her medical license, the foundation of her entire career, was now under a cloud. This was the classic playbook, documented in studies of women leaders in medicine. When you cannot defeat the argument, attack the person's professional standing. The board now had its public pretext. They could argue that the disruption was so severe it was threatening the hospital's licensing and had risen to the level of a professional conduct inquiry. Alana's initial fury cooled into a glacial clarity. They weren't just trying to fire her. They were trying to erase her, to make her an example so potent that no one would dare challenge the hierarchy again. She realized she had been fighting the wrong battle. Appealing to the board's ethics or presenting patient outcome data was futile. She needed to change the board's calculus entirely. Her next move was audacious. She called a press contact from her Johns Hopkins days, but not to tell her own story. She provided anonymized aggregate data from the hospital's own internal surveys, the ones showing the spike in errors and turnover. She connected the journalist with national nursing advocacy groups, who could frame Midtown General not as a singular problem, but as a case study in a national crisis of nurse retention and patient safety. The story broke online at noon the next day. Behind the doors of a prestigious hospital, can culture kill patients? It didn't mention Alana Vance by name. It focused on the systemic issues, quoting the national statistics on how workplace environment directly impacts medical outcomes. But within the hospital, everyone knew whose data had fueled it. The board was apoplectic. Bad press was the one thing they feared more than internal dissent. Donors called. The City Health Oversight Board, where Carol Jenkins's sister sat, demanded a briefing. The special board meeting was no longer just about Alana. It was about containing a public relations wildfire that she had strategically ignited. On the eve of the meeting, the fracture among the nurses became a chasm. A printed flyer appeared on bulletin boards and in break rooms. It read, "Stand with our nurses. Protect our hospital. No to the witch hunt." It was unsigned, but it had Jennifer's network written all over it. It urged nurses to pack the board meeting's public gallery in a show of solidarity against the administration. Simone and Mia saw the flyer as a declaration of war. They worked through the night, using their own networks. They spread the word not about solidarity, but about survival. "This is about our jobs," Mia argued to a skeptical colleague. "If they push her out, the M&M conferences are gone, but so is any chance of fixing why we're drowning. They'll just bring in another old-school chief who sees us as furniture." They urged nurses to come to the meeting, but to listen, not to protest. The morning of the board meeting arrived. The public gallery was indeed packed with staff in teal scrubs. The board members sat at the long table, faces grim. Robert Alden opened with a pained speech about navigating challenging transitions. Then the floor was given to the chairman of the legal review team. He presented the findings with smooth, damning professionalism. He spoke of significant cultural disruption, plummeting staff morale, and the perception of retaliatory systems. He referenced the anonymous complaint to the medical board as evidence of the seriousness of the concerns. His recommendation was clear. The new surgical leadership initiative should be suspended pending a full, independent review, a review that would take months, effectively neutering Alana's authority. When Alana was finally invited to speak, the room tensed. She stood, not at the podium, but at her place at the table. She placed a single sheet of paper in front of each board member. It was not a graph or a defensive argument. It was a signed letter of intent. "This," she said, her voice ringing in the quiet room, "is from the head of the State Nursing Association. They have been monitoring the situation here. They indicate that if the systemic issues raised by their members, issues documented in your own internal reports, are not addressed through good faith reform, they will be compelled to issue a public advisory about working conditions at Midtown General. Such an advisory would likely disqualify us from state clinical training grants and partnership programs with 3 area nursing schools." She let the implication hang in the air. This wasn't about her job anymore. It was about the hospital's pipeline of new staff, its funding, its very ability to function. She had outflanked them. They had tried to make it about her disruptive style. She had made it about their bottom line and their future survival. "The initiatives are not the problem," she continued. "They are the prescribed treatment for the disease your own data confirms. You can choose to shoot the messenger, or you can choose to heal the patient." She sat down. The silence was explosive. The board members stared at the letter, the legal team's bluster suddenly seeming hollow and dangerous. In the gallery, the nurses watched, realizing the power dynamics in the room had just inverted. The board wasn't judging Alana Vance anymore. She was judging them, and she held tangible consequences in her hand. The chairman, flustered, called for a recess. As the board filed into a private anteroom, the public gallery erupted in frantic whispers. The battle was over. The war for the hospital's future was just beginning, and Alana Vance had just proven she understood the real battlefield. It wasn't in the hallway or even the boardroom. It was in the ecosystem that kept the hospital alive, its reputation, its funding, its next generation of staff. She had stopped fighting their game and started playing her own, and she was winning. The board's private recess lasted 27 minutes. When they filed back into the room, the chairman's demeanor had shifted from prosecutorial to conciliatory. He did not call for a vote to suspend Alana's initiatives. Instead, he announced the formation of a joint task force comprising board members, surgical leadership, and staff nurse representatives to oversee the implementation of quality and culture reforms. It was a total capitulation dressed up as collaboration. Alana had won, not by pleading but by presenting a more frightening alternative. The anonymous medical board complaint was quietly withdrawn the following week, its political utility spent. Robert Alden, his authority irreparably damaged, submitted his resignation for personal reasons within a month. The ecosystem had been altered, and the old predators could no longer survive. The consequences unfolded not with a bang, but with the steady click of administrative machinery. Project Nightingale launched as a pilot on the surgical floor. The mentorship program, with protected paid time for preceptors, saw its first cohort of 10 new nurses, a cohort that was 40% people of color, directly addressing the pipeline problem. The Nurse Advisory Council, with Simone as its first elected chair, had its first meeting with Alana. Their first successful proposal, a revamped, transparent schedule bidding system that reduced forced overtime by 15% in the first quarter. For the three nurses in the hallway, the fallout was personal and profound. Carol Jenkins, the 23-year veteran, applied for early retirement. The culture she had mastered was gone, and she had no desire to learn the new one. Her exit interview was polite and frosty. Jennifer, the gossip, found her network crumbling. Nurses who once traded whispers with her now politely excused themselves, fearing the new anonymous reporting system. She transferred to a smaller outpatient clinic, a lateral move that felt like a demotion. But Mia, the youngest, chose a different path. She applied for and was accepted into the first Project Nightingale mentorship cohort. She also volunteered for the peer review committee for the new M&M conferences. In a quiet meeting in Alana's office, Mia apologized, not for fear of reprisal, but from genuine remorse. "I didn't see it until I was part of it," she said. Alana accepted the apology, then assigned her a research task: to analyze the first 3 months of data from the new reporting system. It was a test of trust, and Mia delivered. The systemic changes began to show in the hard numbers. At the 6-month mark, voluntary turnover on the surgical floor had dropped by 22%. Medication error rates, that creeping orange line on Alana's graph, began to trend downward for the first time in 5 years. The hospital's score on the annual National Nursing Satisfaction Survey jumped 40 points, moving it from the bottom quartile to the top half. The State Nursing Association not only withdrew its threat of an advisory, but featured Midtown General as a case study in positive change in its quarterly newsletter. The power dynamic in the hallways changed in subtle, palpable ways. Surgeons now routinely paused during rounds to ask the primary nurse for their assessment. The dismissive, "just get the surgeon" call became less frequent. The new reporting system, feared as a witch hunt, was mostly used to flag systemic issues like broken equipment or confusing policy directives, exactly as intended. Of the handful of interpersonal complaints filed, most were resolved through mediated conversations, not punishments. Alana's leadership cemented itself not through dominance but through demonstrated results. She performed fewer surgeries herself, but the department's overall surgical outcomes improved. She had become a true chief, an architect of systems, a builder of culture. The board, now wary of her, also respected her. She had translated moral imperative into operational success, the only language they truly understood. Then came the final, surprising detail. A year after the hallway incident, the National Healthcare Accreditation Council announced its annual awards. Midtown General Hospital won the Innovation in Clinical Workplace Culture Award. The submission packet, unbeknownst to Alana, had been spearheaded by the Nurse Advisory Council. Simone and Mia had compiled the data, the stories, the before and after graphs. They nominated Alana for individual recognition, but the award was for the institution. At the awards ceremony, Alana insisted that Simone and Mia join her on stage. As the three women stood together, the black chief surgeon, the veteran black nurse, and the young white nurse who had undergone a radical awakening, the image was a powerful full-circle moment. It was no longer about one woman's triumph over bias, but about a community's transformation. In her acceptance speech, Alana didn't talk about her struggles. She talked about the math. We stopped asking who is to blame and started asking what is the problem. The problem was a broken system that hurt patients by exhausting their caregivers. The solution was to trust the expertise in the room, all of it. This award belongs to the staff who chose change over fear. After the ceremony, as they returned to the now familiar halls of Midtown General, Alana passed the same nurse's station. A new trio was there, a different mix of faces. They looked up, offered respectful smiles and nods. "Good afternoon, Dr. Vance," one said. The greeting was professional, devoid of either mocking laughter or terrified deference. It was simply recognition. She nodded back. "How's Mr. Henderson in Fort Wells doing?" The nurse checked the board, gave a crisp update. The exchange was efficient, collaborative, and human. The journey that began with a condescending "sweetie" had ended with a culture of shared purpose. The hierarchy hadn't been destroyed. It had been made permeable, its gates open to competence and collaboration regardless of title, years of service, or scrub's color. Alana Vance had not just kept her job. She had redefined its very meaning, proving that the youngest chief of surgery in the hospital's history wasn't an anomaly to be laughed at, but a harbinger of a more effective, more equitable future. The story of one hallway became the blueprint for an entire institution, and the fight for respect became the foundation for better medicine. The transformation at Midtown General stands as a powerful rebuttal to the notion that workplace culture is a soft, secondary concern. The data proved it was a clinical variable, as critical as any drug or device. When staff feel respected and heard, patient outcomes improve. It's a simple, revolutionary equation that most institutions still ignore. But Alana Vance's story is more than a hospital case study. It's a blueprint for challenging any entrenched system. Her strategy was precise. She armed herself with irrefutable data, built a coalition of the willing, and when attacked, she changed the battlefield from personality to sustainability. She didn't ask for a seat at the table. She demonstrated why the table itself needed redesigning. This matters because the statistics remain stark. While Midtown General improved nationally, only 2% of doctors are black women. Over 60% of nurses of color still report facing racism at work. The assumption that a black woman in a hospital must be anything other than the person in charge is a reflex built by 1,000 daily reinforcements in media, in staffing patterns, in our collective imagination. The lingering question isn't whether change is possible. The story of that hallway proves it is. The real question is about cost. What are we losing in talent, in innovation, in lives, by tolerating environments where potential is dismissed at a glance? Every time a Carol laughs, a Jennifer gossips, or a Mia blindly follows, we aren't just witnessing a personal slight. We are watching a system actively waste its own resources and compromise its own mission. The hope lies in the Mias of the world, those who experience that stomach drop of recognition and choose a different path, and in the Alana Vances, who possess the courage to lead not from ego, but from a clear-eyed vision of what an institution can be when it finally lives up to its own stated values. Their victory wasn't in humiliation, but in transformation. A transformation measured in lower error rates, higher retention, and in the quiet, professional greeting of a nurse who now knows her chief sees her as a partner. If this story resonated with you, leave a like to support this channel. Your engagement helps bring more hidden stories of systemic change into the light. Subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the power dynamics that shape our world, one workplace at a time. The next story is already waiting. Thank you for watching.